Hello Perdu, and thank you for having me. I just treacherously abandoned Linux for Apple, precisely because I wanted to make videos, and I now find that when I'm making videos, I look suspiciously pink. So just to reassure you, I'm not this pink in real life. To introduce myself, my name's Joshua Craze, and I'm a researcher working on the Sudan, where I spent most of my life. I just got to America, which has electricity and tables, which is great, from Sudan, but I thought today, rather than speaking about Sudan, I would talk about back home, so to speak, which is to say the country I'm from, England, and the borders there, and what those borders might mean. And I thought I would start you off by telling you a little just so story, a little fairy story. The border is a line that runs between places. The places enclosed by these lines are constituted as a sphere of sovereignty. They mark a limit point, outside which the imposition of law can no longer be exercised by the power sovereign within the sphere. It is within the area of these lines that the subject population submits to this sovereign power. The border thus marks the territorial limit of the exercise of sovereignty, and by reciprocal acknowledgement of others' sovereign rights to territory, marks the creation of a system of territorial control. In such a just so story, in our fairy tale, the nation-state is identified with its borders and with the continuation of these borders, and anything that threatens these borders is seen as a challenge to the very idea of the nation-state. The border that I've just outlined is interested in producing differences. When you cross the line, you consent to be under the power of a different system of sovereignty. That sovereignty concerns itself with articulating a series of categories under which people can live: migrant, visa national, national. In such a framework, the illegal immigrant can only be seen as abhorrent. He has violated this articulation of legal difference by slipping in without the consent of the sovereign power. I want to suggest that even if such a conception of the border was once congruent with the way borders are organized, and I'm not even sure about that, it is certainly not so today. Part of the reason for this is the change in the structure of our borders. The national border contains with it two distinct but overlapping functions. Actually, these two functions, which seem unified and which I'm about to explain, are in constant tension. This tension is becoming increasingly apparent as the proper space allocated to each break down. So to say that much less abstractly, the border functions to produce a people, an ethnos, for whom the border designates the limit point of the ability to say we. We don't support the French football team, ever. And so produces a nation. This function, the border is the creation of an inner unity, the English people recognizing the English football team and not the French football team, even if they win. I call this the internal function of the border. The internal function is not bound up with the exercise of state power in a simple way. The internal constituency of a population that responds to a we requires that there be an outside. But how this outside is constituted is not predetermined by the internal function of the border. The need for a we is never a sufficient condition for the creation of an immigration policy, though it may well play a role. The border, at least in Europe, allows this ethnos to have rights, access to social security, to be citizens, to be part of a demos, however impoverished. To be citizens requires that they are non-citizens and that they are located outside of the border. The border also marks the extent of sovereignty. It controls, admits, denies. It organizes the flow of non-citizens who want to enter sovereign space. Ultimately, it creates subjects as legal or illegal, and so produces a state. This function, the border, is the creation of the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, the creation of a demos which is subject of representation and rights. I call its external function. So on one hand we have an internal function, which is about recognizing ourselves or a group's selves as a nation, and that's not bound up with state power. That might be antagonistic to it in a bunch of ways I'm about to tell you about. And on the other hand, we have the external function, which is literally the political structure of what a border is. It admits, it denies, and so on. This external function is bound up with a state in a seemingly much more direct way than the internal function. Borders make populations themselves the ultimate reference of the constitution of political power in a framework of recognised territorial limits. The organisation of the population in a territory is the basis of sovereignty in the nation-state system. These two functions are of course aspects of the same border, but it is important to understand the tensions and differences between, on the one hand, a network of identification and affiliation, the English football team, not the French football team, and on the other, a network that organises flows according to the concerns of sovereign power. So a simple example, flows that are considered beneficial to the state and to the demos they represent, such as immigrants entering a country and boosting the economy, might be seen as highly undesirable by the ethnos, by a group which is defined as a we in contrast to a they, which ideally would like to be kept far away, or at least across the other side of the channel. It may be the case that the communities produced by the internal function of the border are imagined, and thus correspondingly the institutions that maintain these borders are also imagined. Now I suppose this is true as far as it goes, but it misses the one important way that the border is experienced as natural, as outside of the constitution of a community, as a space where in which people exist before the entry of a subject into a system of sovereignty, in which he is in some way a citizen. The tension between the external and internal function of the border is exemplified at the border itself. The border is the sole place where the ethnos experiences itself as a subject. The illegal and the legal alike are shepherded into the same queues. To give a very practical example of that, you saw when some of the Americans who were involved in WikiLeaks came back into the country, they had all their computer equipment and so on confiscated in a way that would not be possible within the country, where you'd have to show due cause and there are a whole series of legal restrictions. But in the space of the border itself, there is a space of legal indetermination in which both the citizen proper to a country, the Englishman trying to get into England, and the illegal immigrant both experience life as subjects. The border is absolutely undemocratic. All other institutions of the state may change. The border, and here I speak of its structure, not its particular territorial arrangement, does not. One does not take part in a negotiation at the border, unless you're in Sudan. There is no contract with the state at the border. There is the state. Even the transnational frameworks we have today, precisely because they are still organised along state lines, do not change the phenomenology of this encounter. But it's these borders which are supposedly collapsing today. One of the most common arguments is to claim that the border of the nation-state is increasingly circumscribed by capital. As the president of Volkswagen famously claimed, politics is now a field of manoeuvre limited by the economy, and the economy is now constrained by the stock market. It is not just capital that has supposedly rendered nation-state borders less important. Others see a wave of reterritorialization, transnational phenomena, ethnic identities, and local divisions crystallizing in the wake of the state. So a whole bunch of things both penetrating the nation-state's borders and reterritorializing within the nation-state in a way that makes those borders much less important. My problem with all these theories is that they leave untouched the assumption, which we mentioned in that first Just So story I said to you, that the state is interested in the border as a place where it has total control. All these theories leave in place the idea that legal and illegal, state and non-state, are somehow opposed, and they're not. Borders no longer occur at the physical border themselves, the physical border itself. They are not simply passport checks at Dover. They are also holding centres for asylum seekers. They are checks on the street for illegal immigrants. And this means, if you recall our emphasis on how the border is experienced as natural, that citizens are increasingly experiencing life as subjects and not citizens within the state. What is happening could be summed up as follows. The borders of the state are increasingly incongruous in a complicated way with the borders of the nation. There are a whole series of flows, capital flows, labour flows, and transnational agreements such as human rights acts and organisations like the EU, that now call into question the previously settled relationship between the exterior and the interior border. I'm not suggesting it was ever practically settled. I hope to have gone some way to suggesting that this relationship will always be in tension, but it was conceptually agreed upon, and now that agreement is breaking down. The ethnos is not taking this line down. There is, in much of Europe, as you all well know, an increased hostility to flows, crucially of people, and much moaning about the threat to our way of life, the way of the we, and not the French football team. What is happening now seems to fit perfectly into the old scheme of Frederick Bath. There is a tendency for lines to become more important to people the moment they are under threat, at the moment, to go one step further than Bath, that they are the least viable. Today, the borders of the ethnos are crystallizing around lines both encouraged by the state and inimical to the state's development. I'll give one example of these lines. One of the biggest concerns of the British public, if you believe the Daily Mail, is benefit fraud by illegal immigrants. There is a line of entitlement here that is primarily one of ethnos. We don't want health tourism, as it is called in a Home Office booklet. But this internal claim is always expressed within the legal framework of the exterior border. Health tourism in the Daily Mail is a practice of illegal immigrants. It deprives the national ethnos. And yet the law that is asked to help restrain these exploitative immigrants stealing the British patrimony is already crisscrossed by entitlements, like that for EU citizens, that complicates any claim that British healthcare is for the British alone. This confusion between the two types of claim, juridical and ideological, I suppose, finds its way into government publications, and we will look at one of those briefly in a second. If we pursue this line of argument, then it would seem that the resolution would be, we need new border institutions that are not rooted in the discourse of the nation-state, that are not nationalistic, but adapted to the situation in which we live, that form a new notion of ethnos, a new notion of demos, hopefully not a new notion of ethnos, and situate that within the changing ethnos of Europe. Such an argument says simply, the ethnos and demos are in tension today, and we must heal the gap. Now, I might even agree with this, but something's not quite right. This resolution assumes that states are being damaged by the fact that their borders are in question, that they don't want these changes, and then it also assumes that states have not already adapted, that their practices are not increasingly bypassing the territorial border, and the apparent state failure, to borrow a word we use more happily about Africa, is not actually something desirable for the state. So the problem with the theories of globalizations I just mentioned is not so much in the arguments about the borders of the nation-state changing, but the conclusions they draw from this with regard to the state. All the ideas of states being challenged by immigration, bypassed by capital, and increasingly constricted by the economic have a fairly unproblematic view of the relationship between the state, the law, and the border. We could sum up their position as follows. The border determines relationships of legality, illegality, which are consonant with the law and which are decided by the state. But to return to our original distinction and the function of the border between the internal ethnos nationalistic function and the external state function, the external function does not simply delimit the legal and the illegal. It organizes flows of things. In the first of the Collège de France lectures that Foucault gave on security, territory, and population, he outlines an example in 3 modulations. First, there is the penal system. It's relatively simple. There is a prohibition, you shall not steal, and there is a punishment, a hanging. The second is a slight variation on the first model, this is the disciplinary. You have the same law and the same punishment, but now you have a whole series of checks and controls that frame the law, and a whole series of techniques, moralization, correction, that frame